I have a note here. She's the greatest urban farmer. Turned her yard into a farm. And she doesn't have a big yard. I have an extensive home garden with many fruit trees. How many?
44, I think.
44. Shrubs and vines, and grow a small urban vegetable garden with herbs and perennial vegetables as well. So here is Kathleen.
So thank you all for coming today. We're going to talk about trash. Actually, my husband said I should trash talk Molly, but I couldn't think of anything clever to say, so anyway. So the question is, disposable. What does disposable mean? And so I like to look at definitions. I'm kind of into this because it helps us all get on the same page. So a disposable article, they're saying it's intended to be used once or until it's no longer useful. That includes everything that we put in our dump, and then thrown away. And as an example, disposable diapers. So the synonyms are throwaway, expendable, one use, non-returnable, replaceable, and there are others. So where is the way? So if we're going to throw it away, where is the way? That becomes the question. So there was a garbage scow. Commander Riker and the Enterprise came to Gamelon 5's aid by towing a garbage scow safely away from the planet. Away. So this unmanned sublight garbage scow freighter of unknown origin was pulled into the orbit of Gamelon 5, and its toxic cargo leaked. The ensuing radiation caused atmospheric radiation levels to increase by 3,000%. So then the question is space a way? Because it worked for Commander Riker and the Enterprise. Is space a way? So there are, unfortunately I can't read that here, I'll get over here. There are around 7,200 metric tons of space debris which are capable of damaging satellites or spacecraft, and they're currently orbiting the Earth by scientists' estimates. As of 2016, the U.S. Strategic Air Command tracked a total of almost 18,000 artificial objects in orbit above the Earth. And that included about 1,400 operational satellites. Now, what they're tracking is only those that are large enough to track. The articles, the space debris that's not large enough to track, essentially sandpapers our equipment when we take it through space. So it sandblasts things, so solar plant panels and optic equipment gets damaged by this space debris. So is this trash a way? The Kessler syndrome is a postulated runaway chain of an reaction, and by that, the collisions exponentially increase the amount of debris, and it's hypothesized to ensue when the critical masses or density is achieved, and it affects the usefulness of our polar orbiting bands, and it increases the cost of production for spacecraft missions because it requires more shielding and all that for the equipment. And whether or not the Kessler syndrome is already underway has been debated. But we could have, I mean, I don't know whether the internet TV comes through the space, through our satellites or not. But if we lost our satellites, I think we would lose GPS, and who knows what all else we might lose. But is space away? I don't think Commander Riker and the Enterprise are going to come to our rescue. And space is not away, obviously. So how about landfills? Are landfills away? They're speculating that we will run out of room in landfills within 18 years. And some states, like New York, already ship their waste over state line because they don't have any space within their borders to put it. And other states are enacting disposal bans which prohibit certain types of waste from being put in their landfills and incinerators. And the ban prevents trash from the states like New York from entering their states. But there are other costs of landfill operations, and the EPA does raise issues with the use of landfill operations for compostable materials. That's a key factor there. So, what are the costs of landfills? In a modern landfill, I don't know if people still have the misconception that landfill is where we take our stuff to get to decompose and become part of the land and grow interesting vegetation, whatever. But that's not how landfills are. We had a landfill on our property years ago, and we were really offended because the local antique dealer came and stole all the antique bottles out of it, dug around in there, and raided our dump. Anyway, so what are the costs of landfill? The landfills require that tightly packed mounds of waste are sealed under a rubber and clay barrier and over a liner that keeps liquids from seeping out. In order to do this, we have to allocate land, we have to construct these barriers, and so on. It's a complex and expensive construction. We have to maintain those landfills, and then we have trucking costs, the transportation, usually fossil fuel, to take our trash to the landfills, and then there's labor, including the truck drivers and things at the landfill. There are emissions and climate change issues with landfills into perpetuity. Now the EPA estimates that only 1/3, roughly, of municipal solid waste goes to landfills which capture methane for energy use. And they estimate that another third, roughly, captures the methane emitted by the landfill, but burns it off, like in smokestacks or whatever. The other, roughly a third, just allow the methane from the landfill to volatilize and escape to the atmosphere. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas. So we're saying that in landfills, 1/3 capture the methane for positive use, 1/3 burn it off just to get rid of it, because it's a greenhouse gas, and then 1/3 just allow it to escape and add to our greenhouse gas issues. This is from Cornell Law School, and it talks about all the regulations around landfills, and there are plenty. So, landfills are not away. Here's what goes on in perpetuity in a landfill. There are location restrictions within those legal restrictions. There are composite liner requirements, a flexible membrane overlaying, 2 feet of compacted clay soil lining for the bottom and sides of the landfill And then protection is required for the groundwater and the underlying soil from the leachate that comes out of the landfill. So the leachate collection and removal system sits on top of the composite liner and removes leachate for treatment and disposal. So they don't just, they actually have to treat and dispose the leachate coming out of the landfill. And this goes on, their groundwater monitoring requirements and the groundwater testing wells have to determine whether waste materials have escaped from the landfill, and then their post-closure and closure care requirements, including covering the landfill and providing long-term care of closed landfills. And we have a lot of closed landfills in the U.S. I mean, online you can find a map of them. They're all over the place. And then financial insurance that the landfill will be maintained, as I said, in perpetuity. So what about composting? Composting is stuff that doesn't go to the landfill, obviously. It's a process to speed, this is from the USDA, to speed up the natural decay of organic material by providing ideal conditions for detritus-eating organisms to thrive, according to the USDA. And the end product is a concentrated concentrated decomposition process is a nutrient-rich soil that can help crops, garden plants, and trees to grow. Now I have to point out the fact that compost, or organic material, requires water to be produced. Organic material doesn't come out of nowhere. It requires water. Therefore, compost, in my view, is a very valuable product, and our resources have a lot of commonality. Now, in physics, we know that light can be transformed into electricity, it can be transformed into heat, it can perform other transformations. And I'm not talking about that kind of transformation, but our resources have a similar commonality, meaning that we can take some of our resources and produce others. As an example, we can take land and water, and with a hydroelectric plant, we can produce electricity. And compost is something we've produced with our water, and it has value, and we shouldn't be sending it to landfills for that and other reasons. So we need not to send our resources to landfills. The landfills are designed to never be mined. It's not something we expect the archaeologists to exhume and learn all about us. They're designed to never ever release those things and never ever get them back. So compost again is organic material which can be added to soil to help plants grow. Food scraps and yard waste together, which is organic material, make up about 30% of what we throw away and should be composted instead. Making compost keeps these material out of landfills where they take up space and release methane, which is the potent greenhouse gas. Now the Federal Trade Commission has gone to some length to define various terms because of what they're calling greenwashing, which is attempts by companies or whatever to paint themselves with in a favorable light using language that's perceived as green. So that Federal Trade Commission came up with some definitions, and I believe this is something further down in their document. The summary that I read didn't include this, but what they're saying is that for a product to be labeled compostable, all materials in the product or package need to break down or become part of usable compost safely in about the same amount of time as the materials with which it's composted, which means that if it's compostable and you put it in your home compost pile, 6 or 8 months later, it shouldn't resurface and be recognizable. It should have blended in and broken down. So it breaks down aerobically into carbon dioxide, water, inorganic compounds, and biomass in small pieces in about 90 days. And that's their definition of compostable. So how do we cope with our trash? One list I ran into is this one: avoid disposables, buy less if you don't need it, repair and reuse, repurpose, whenever possible, home compost, and as a last resort, recycle. There are issues with recycling that have magnified in recent years, and we'll go over that. So this involves retraining our habits, planning ahead for reuse and repurposing. That means bring your own reusable bags. Choose reusable containers and covers. This means trying to plan for something other than plastic wrap, which is not recyclable and contributes to our plastic issues. Buy in bulk if possible, bringing your own bag, obviously. And then compost your food scraps and yard waste whenever possible. And try to reduce your junk mail. We receive apparently about 30 pounds of it a year. So this is the Federal Trade Commission summary of the Green Guides. And it is to address the issue of greenwashing, which is conveying a false impression that a company or its products are more environmentally sound than they really are. And the muddle of definitions around these terms has prompted the FTC to issue this green guide. And in the summary, I found references to compostable and degradable. And the compostable, they only say that it safely and in the same time as the materials with which it is composted. And then also the fact that if the compostable item doesn't include both the product and the packaging, that the manufacturer, the marketer, needs to explicitly say so. And then regarding degradable, they're saying that they can only make that claim if they can prove that the entire package or product will completely break down and return to nature, whatever that means, within a reasonably short period of time after customary disposal. And they're defining that as a year. So they're saying that any product that will not degrade within a year, they can't make such claims. They did not mention in that document biodegradable or decomposable. So those are terms that have not really been very well covered. So the muddle of life definitions. We have issues with biodegradable materials such as disposable cups and utensils, which are broken down in landfills by microorganisms that then produce methane. In other words, any biodegradable material that ends up in the landfill produces methane. Even if the company is touting this as a green product and environmentally favorable because it's biodegradable, if it ends up in the landfill, it doesn't matter whether it's biodegradable or it's not. If it's biodegradable, it will generate methane because it will degrade some. And if it's not biodegradable, it inhabits the landfill the way that the landfill was designed. In other words, it doesn't break down. So all these issues with biodegradability have to do as much with what happens to that product as it does to what the nature of the product is. So it doesn't help to have it be designed to have an end of life in a certain way if that's not where it ends up. And we do not want biodegradable materials in our landfills because they generate methane. Now the definition I'm finding for biodegradable is decomposed by bacteria or other living organisms. It's not decomposable, it's biodegradable. So looking at plastics that are said to be decomposable, that's another thing, and it's not a good thing in my view. So of those biodegradable products, if they degrade in using aerobic things, but it doesn't include methane. It's anaerobic digestion that releases methane, and methane is the big issue in landfills. So biodegradable and compostable are a couple, two different things too, and the distinction being offered is that compostable results in compost or humus, whereas biodegradable broadly means that it can biologically break down. So what about compostable items? And this is what I'm talking about, is this PLA, which is the plastic-like material made from corn. And there was a conversation apparently recorded from Peter Canepa, who's a life cycle assessment specialist with the Department of Environmental Quality in Oregon, and he had a conversation by email with Live Science, and he cited two studies done on PLA, and one of them said that in landfills it broke down anaerobically and released methane, which is kind of what we would expect. And then there was another study that found that it didn't break down at all in a landfill, and therefore didn't produce significant greenhouse gas emissions. But in any case, landfills are generally anaerobic, and so these materials don't compost. They either persist or they break down anaerobically, is what he's telling us. And so here's the rub. Commercial composting facilities do not accept compostable dishware typically. Now, we don't, I think, locally have commercial composting facilities to examine. So some of this, in a way, doesn't relate directly to us. However, so these commercial composting facilities won't accept this PLA material. So the end result is it ends up in the landfill. And so it hasn't really really accomplished an improvement, because it ends up being something that generates methane gas. So he's saying that about half of the municipal solid waste of all kinds of trash sources ends up in the landfill, while composting accounts for just under 9%. This is according to Canepa, and he's quoting from the EPA. So he co-authored a report which about compostable dishware, and he concluded in the report that those tended to have higher environmental impacts across their life cycle than non-compostable equivalents. So there's a ton of work being done to try to get around some of our trash issues, but they're not all working, and that's probably an example. So what about FTC's degradable designation? Is there any virtue in that? The Federal Trade Commission is allowing people to label things as degradable, okay? And in fact, I ran across one on a styrofoam coffee cup coming out of the hospital over in Prescott Valley, to my horror, frankly. So the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association website says that plastics will degrade into small pieces until you can't see them anymore, or you'll need a microscope or better. But do they go away? They say the full degradation into carbon dioxide, water, and inorganic molecules is called mineralization, and most commonly used plastics do not mineralize or go away in the ocean, and instead they break down into smaller and smaller pieces. We call these pieces microplastics if they're less than 5 millimeters long. And the rate of degradation depends on a lot of things, what plastic it is and what the environmental conditions and other things. So essentially, bags, which are touted as degradable, are definitely not beneficial and can be worse for the environment. Degradable bags that disintegrate just become tinier and tinier pieces of microplastic quicker and still pose serious threats to marine life. Microplastics enter the food chain lower down, getting eaten by smaller species, and then continue to make their way up the food chain as these smaller species are consumed. And there's a photo online of a piece of a plankton eating choking on a piece of microplastic. And so Professor Tony Underwood from Sydney described degradable plastic bags as not a solution to anything much, unless we are quite happy to shift it all into particle-sized plastics rather than plastic bag-sized plastics. In my view, the bigger the piece of plastic is, there are issues with sea life getting tangled in it. However, once it gets down to the size of 5 millimeters, there is no recovering it. We can't gather it up, we can't recycle it, we can't do anything with it. It's in the environment then in perpetuity, and that's quite a problem in my view. So, plastics. Who all remembers Dustin Hoffman in the movie The Graduate? So he was at a party and one of the adults was telling him that plastics were where it's at. And this film was in 1967. Our plastics addiction started in about 1940 and has just continued to get worse. So microplastics. Where all are the microplastics coming from? They're coming from synthetic fibers in our washing machines at the rate of 1 million tons per year. Now what happens in the wash is you take your clothes. We used to have 100% cotton clothing. I can remember not liking the fact that you had to nearly always iron all of it, which I don't really do, but anyway. The synthetic fibers in the clothing that you run through the wash, they fracture, they get tiny. Your washing machine has a filter where the wash water goes through. It filters some of this stuff out, and then it backwashes it out into the sewer system. So it backwashes all those tiny microfibers into the sewer system, into the atmosphere or the environment. Then you take your stuff out of the washing machine, you put it in the dryer, and you beat those fibers up some more, and you fracture them some more, and you break them down some more, and you get more teeny-itsy microfibers, and some of them get caught in the lint trap. I can remember when lint out of your dryer was considered to be a great compost additive. And anymore, since it's not all cotton fibers, there's a real strong question as to whether that's a good idea or not. So that's where some of the microfibers come from. Some of the stuff that's caught in the dryer gets caught in the lint trap. Some of it passes on through. It probably goes out the vent on your roof. And some of it probably ends up in your house. So that's the story with about our plastics and synthetics in our fabrics and our clothing. So tire dust is another source, and they computed it per kilometer. Paint dust, they're saying that it's 10% of the ocean's microplastics. 10%. Secondary, another source is secondary from the degradation of 8 million tons of mishandled plastic trash every year. So anyway, actually plastic that gets left out in the environment, UV breaks it down. So any plastic that gets broken down, that gets degraded, has the potential of producing microplastics. Another is synthetic fibers in the air from, for example, fabric abrasion in like carpet fabrics. You walk across your carpet, you break it down. Some of that is aerosolized or whatever, and it floats around your house. If you sit in your house and the light comes in just right, you can see stuff floating around in your air in your house. Another source is microbeads, and I think that was in cosmetics, and that's been ended. So what about microplastics? Microplastics are also turning up in tap and bottled water. They're turning up in seafood, and they're turning up in the air in our houses. Now, Scott Belcher, who's a PhD, he's a research professor at North Carolina State University, and he was a spokesman for the Endocrine Society. And he's made this statement. He's saying that chemicals from plastics are a constant part of our daily diet. We generally assume the water bottle holding that pure spring water, the microwave-safe plastic bowl we prepare our meals in, or the styrofoam cup holding a hot drink is there protecting our food and drinks rather than acting as a completely inert barrier. These plastics are breaking down and leaching chemicals, including endocrine disrupting plasticizers like BPA or phthalates, flame retardants, and even toxic heavy metals that are all absorbed into our diets and bodies. This is from the Endocrine Society. So how about human microplastic consumption? We talked about the aerosolized microfibers that are in our homes that we're inhaling. We're physiologically designed to inhale particulates and things that, through the beginning of time, that's what mucus is for. Mucus and cilia, to capture that stuff so you can cough it out. What about when we swallow it? So they, in England, they had a good muscle business, I guess, muscle diet. And muscle consumption becomes interesting or of concern. So somebody did a little study, and they put a petri dish next to the plate of people eating in their homes, and then they compared that with the, I mixed it up, it's in the next slide. They mixed it up, or they compared it with the microfibers that were in the mussels that the people were eating at dinner. And they concluded that we got so much out of our air, the fallout from the carpet fibers and whatever else, in the food that we're eating, that the mussels compared favorably with what you're consuming just because of the fallout from the air. Now, mussels are an interesting thing. I mean, the reason they zeroed in on them is they are a giant little filtration mechanism. They have a intake tube. They suck in the ocean water. They filter it, take out what they consider to be food particles, and they squirt out the rest of the water. The water that had all the good stuff taken out. So presumably they would concentrate these things. But they said that, but that was the conclusion they reached, that we eat enough off of our plate that it didn't matter about the mussels. Now these things here are a couple of food sources that we have that do have microfibers in them. One was fish, and the other one was clothing fiber, which got interwoven into an oyster shell. So it got incorporated. There was enough microfiber there for the oyster to actually calcify around or whatever and make it part of its shell. So fish containing plastic fragments or microfibers. The one on the right is the mussel I was mentioning. They did something to the microfibers to illuminate them. And then the fish on the left is a fish that consumed 17 plastic fragments. And we don't know what this kind of pollution has as a role on human exposures to toxic chemicals. There was a lot of concern that in what I read that the plastic itself wasn't the only issue. It was what the plastic absorbed in the ocean, wherever the plastic had been, the toxic chemicals, because under certain circumstances, those toxins get released, having to do with temperatures and whatever. So this was identified as being actually an unknown consequence. They were saying that we excrete most of the microfibers that we ingest. And there wasn't a huge concern with that in particular, although the stuff that gets really small, there are issues with that because it can pass through cell walls and so on. But the issues are with what the plastics are permeated with that gets released in your digestive system. So now, what about plastic pollution in the ocean? These are two things. This is a plastic that got wrapped around this turtle, and the turtle was still alive by some miracle. This turtle down here is totally tangled up. Apparently turtles in particular are at risk with the plastic in the ocean, although there are tons of pictures of all sorts of sea life being impacted by plastic in the ocean. So there's a picture of the amount of plastic that's gathering out somewhere. Now, what happens is the currents, the ocean currents gather it into a place where there's some turmoil or whatever, and the stuff that gets concentrated in those places. So again, here's this statement about how much plastic. An estimated 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic have been produced globally, and they're saying 75% has been thrown away. So a lot of it has ended up in the oceans, and they're saying 8.3 billion metric tons altogether, 8 million metric tons every minute? Oh, each year, yeah. And they're saying it's equivalent of a garbage truck every minute. So if these trends continue, there will be 12 billion metric tons of plastic waste in the world by 2050. And none of this stuff is biodegradable or compostable. We can make it into smaller pieces, and the smaller pieces are not good. So here's something that I think is kind of comforting in a way, in a kind of a back-assed way. We're not the worst. Hallelujah. China is, evidently. Some of these countries, I think the issue is the fact that either they're small companies or they have a lot of coastline. But these are the ones that are contributing the plastic waste in the oceans, the top 20 countries, and we're on the list. We're just not the worst. So why aren't they biodegradable? This gets kind of technical, but I had to know. So I went and looked, and it has to do with carbon-carbon bonds, right here. And apparently those don't occur in nature. We take petroleum and we heat it really to extreme temperatures and add some things and turn it into plastics. But these carbon-carbon bonds don't occur in nature, and the natural biological processes that would break them down have never evolved. So whether or not there's any biological remedy, I don't know. But they're saying that it was discussed why we don't make plastics not using the carbon-carbon bonds, because then they would break down. And the answer, so Jim Coleman, the chief scientist at the U.S. Geological Survey Energy Resources Program, his end comment was, well, when you buy a plastic jar of mayonnaise, you want the mayonnaise, or the jar to last longer than the mayonnaise. And these carbon-carbon bonds are the ones that do it. And the naturally occurring types of bonds don't. So I think I talked about this already. The PLA generates methane if it goes to a landfill. And if it goes to a recycling bin, it harms the quality of the recycled products. And it falls into the category of recycling. And most of our consumer compost piles don't get hot enough and are not maintained well enough to accomplish the decomposition of that product. And waste-to-energy plants. Okay, here's an interesting one. In the Netherlands, the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs published a report on their state-of-the-art installation, which is touted to be the best in Western Europe. But their testing revealed that it emits dioxin, furans, and toxic pollutants far beyond the limits set by EU laws. So the best waste-to-energy product or installation they could come up with just isn't cutting the mustard. And they're saying that waste-to-energy might as well be waste to air pollution because it adds to carbon emissions. So that process isn't working all that well. So I mentioned this before, 83 million metric tons have been produced. Approximately 6,300 million metric tons of plastic waste has been generated. About 9% have been recycled. 12% was incinerated, that's like the waste to energy thing. And 79% was accumulated in landfills or the natural environment like the ocean. Now, given current production and waste management trends, there will be roughly 12,000 million metric tons of plastic waste in landfills by 2050. So this is not a good forecast. Whoops. So regarding recycling, the Associate Dean of Research of Science and Engineering at Plymouth University, he made a statement about it, and he's saying that plastics are inherently recyclable, which I think is pretty obvious. And what's preventing us from recycling, he argues, is inadequate, inappropriate, or lack of proper consideration on the design stage what's going to happen at end of life. So that's his summation of it. These are the recycling charts, and more than half of our plastic packaging can't be recycled. More than half. Over here it says, the code, the existence of the code does not tell you whether it can or will be recycled, unfortunately. So there is some ground to be covered with recycling. Here it is again. This code is the one that they actually put that, was it PLA, the corn plastic into. We're really working pretty hard on our recycling, but we've got a long way to go. Okay, so plastics are essentially non-biodegradable. Some are extremely difficult to recycle, and those that are difficult to sell or recycle are less commonly accepted by recyclers. There is a rejection factor. In other words, putting it in the recycling bin does not force the recyclers to deal with it. It does not. We can sort it to our best of our ability, but the fact that we think it ought to be recycled doesn't justify putting it in the recycling bin. So if there is no code, then you can't tell whether it can be recycled or not. And people are being advised to throw plastic in the trash to avoid contaminating the recycling stream. The best, most effective way to take care of this is disposal bans, which I mentioned. North Carolina now, I think, has put some in place that are preventing it being the dumping ground of New York City. But anyway, so here are 3 categories that are almost never recycled. Number 3, which is plastic wraps. It's any PVC or vinyl. That's your PVC pipes, it's the vinyl siding on your house. That stuff should be recycled, but it's not. And then styrofoam. And I recently read what the problem with styrofoam is. It's so high volume that they can't transport it legitimately. They can't get it to where they can recycle it. And so styrofoam has not been recycled. And then number 7, that's some plastics, nylon, and toys or electronics that are only partly plastic. Anytime they mix it together with something else, that puts it in category 7, and those things don't get recycled. So landfills. At the start of 2018, the Chinese government enacted a ban on the import of various kinds of low-grade plastics and other materials that are extremely hard to recycle. And we've been exporting about 1/6 of our recyclable material to China, and they slammed the door on it. So now waste processors are scrambling to figure out alternative places to send it. And the amount of solid waste which is being produced is rising. with 4.4 pounds of trash per person per day. So 63,000 garbage trucks per day. Anyway, China's national sword policy. This is what was enacted in January of 2018. And they're saying it was a move to halt a deluge of soiled and contaminated materials that was overwhelming. The Chinese processing facilities and it was overwhelming the Chinese processing facilities and leaving the country with yet another environmental problem, which they didn't create in a way. So, and they're saying that our collect, sort, and export model, sending it to China, is end of life. We're not going to be able to do that anymore, and that comes from yale.edu. So the recycling programs all over the U.S. are being affected, and the Tucson News stated that the markets for newspaper and glass products have collapsed, and there have been continued declines in glass and paper recycling industries in our country. And the councilman said, well, let's not give up. Let's hang in there because it could change. And then, interestingly, Chris Yarder, who's the chair of the Environmental Services Advisory Committee there, stated that, in fact, as far as she knows, those plastic products are already sent to the landfill. Now, another person there, the Christina Polsgrove of City Environmental Services Department spokeswoman, said that's not true. But the point is, this is Chris Yarder, the point is, we don't know. If she doesn't know, how would we know? I mean, that's her job, is to know where the stuff's going. And she said she didn't know that it wasn't going to the landfill. So anyway, there are a lot of issues with recycling. And obviously, we don't know exactly what's going on. So, help wanted. We need help for the strategy of our end-of-life plastics. We have all these plastics, and here's the statement that came out of the Science Mag. It says, without a well-designed and tailor-made management strategy for end-of-life plastics, humans are conducting a singular, uncontrolled experiment on a global scale, in which billions of metric tons of material will accumulate across all major terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems on the planet. The relative advantages and disadvantages of dematerialization, substitution, reuse, material recycling, waste to energy, and conversion technology must be carefully considered to design the best solutions to the environmental challenges posed by the enormous and sustained global growth in plastic production and use. So we need help with that. Now, what about bioremediation? I do bring this up because I believe the BP oil spill was fixed by bioremediation using bacteria. And as I said, they've determined that it's these carbon-carbon bonds that are preventing composting or biodegradability of these plastics. But there's been some progress made in micro-remediation, and there might be some opportunities there. So, climate change. So, municipal solid waste is the third largest source of human-related methane emissions in the United States. It's 14.1%. At the same time, methane emissions from landfills represent a lost opportunity to capture and use a significant energy source. That statement's coming from the EPA. Now, there are technologies to capture and utilize these gases, and those technologies have been implemented in some places by a few landfills. And the EPA is saying organic waste should be banned from disposal to landfill. So decomposition anaerobically, as I mentioned before, releases methane and other greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to global warming. And landfill gas is about half methane and about half carbon dioxide, with a few other non-methane organic compounds. And methane is 28 to 36 times more effective than carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere over time. So enough. Here's the question. Do we have enough stuff? 5% of the world's population and generate 30% of the world's garbage. We move about, we manipulate about 4 million pounds of material to provide one average middle-class American family's needs for 1 year. 4 million pounds, wow. In sum, the U.S. wastes or cause to be waste nearly 1 million pounds of materials per person every year. So if we factor in wastewater, they're saying that less than 2% of the total waste stream in the United States is recycled. Of what we throw out, they're saying half could be recycled. And they say what we throw away is enough aluminum to build an entire commercial air fleet every 3 months, enough steel to reconstruct Manhattan, and enough wood to heat 5 million homes for 200 years. And that our disposal costs exceed $100 million annually. So that brings us around to this book, Your Money or Your Life. So this book was published in 1992, and I think I bought it in the original printing back then. I don't subscribe to everything that they propose, but this book addresses directly the question of what is enough. They talk about our values. Our values are very intractable, right along with our eating preferences, our food eating habits, and so on. They're developed early in life, but they're trying to address the issue of consumption was one end of it. They're saying if somebody put a gun in your ribs and said that sentence, what would you do? And they're saying most of us would turn over our wallets. And what they're saying in the book is that instead, we sell our lives bit by bit by bit for wages. And we give up a fair amount of the quality of our lives by doing so. And the question is, do we value our lives more than we value our money, or do we? So we are identified as consumers if we're not identified with our jobs. And according to the dictionary, to consume is to destroy, squander, or use up. And we are thinking of, culturally, we've thought of shopping as recreation. And their adage is like, so we shop till we drop. Here's another one is retail therapy. Have you heard that one? So, yeah. Anyway, they had some good ideas in there. So getting to that, clothing. How about clothing? And that has a lot to do with our consumption products, because this stuff, the clothing does get consumed in a way. It counts for 1 billion tons of CO2 per year, 5% of the world's greenhouse gases, and that's clothing production. Emissions from polyester production were equivalent to 185 coal-fired power plants. Yeah, we landfill 65 pounds of clothing per person per year. Much of it before anyone buys it. Why? The clothing is too cheap. Before advanced manufacturing, synthetics and offshore labor, we spent 13 to 15% of our annual budget on clothing. Now we spend 3.5%. The financial constraints on buying clothing have been sort of removed. In 2014, 100 billion pieces of new clothing were manufactured, 14 pieces per person on Earth. We now buy more and we wear it half as long. So, the takeaway from this is that whatever they have for sale at the thrift stores, you can be pretty sure it's not worn out. And give it a second time around. This is from a PBS series called The Hot Mess. It's a good series. And this episode was Green is the New Black. So that's clothing. So this checklist comes from Your Money of Your Life. And they're saying don't shop. I think you can, yeah, I think you can add to that, don't shop online, don't read the flyers that come in the mail, don't shop, and this brings to mind the thing in the Silence of the Lambs. He said to Clarice, he said, you covet what you see. That was his comment, and it was his clue to solving that mystery. But you covet what you see. That was his help in solving that crime. But anyway, don't shop. Live within your means. That talks to credit cards. Take care of what you have. Wear it out. Do it yourself. That's talking about hiring people. They're talking, partly what they're talking about in this book is managing your expenditures so that you can control, you can reduce your cost of living. Do it yourself. Anticipate your needs. That means look ahead so that you're prepared financially. Research the value, the quality, the durability, and multiple uses of something you're thinking of buying. Get it for less and buy used. Now, I'm repeating this again, but 5% of the world's population, 30% of the world's garbage. So how about too much stuff? There's a woman called Marie Kondo. She's a really cute Japanese girl. And she wrote this book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. She also had a TV series. And she was really cute, and I imagine she's fluent in English, but they always had a translator because it made it more appealing story. But anyway, her book was amazingly successful. She's a Japanese woman who specialized in decluttering and organizing. And then she talks about if you have something, ask yourself whether the item gives you joy. And if it does, she says to keep it. If it doesn't, and then the quotation says that the donation box is right over there by the door. Well, I watched one of her episodes, and I don't remember the donation box. I think I remember seeing a recycling bin at the curb with piles and piles of plastic bags full of crap. So I don't think she put nearly enough emphasis on where it came from or what its ultimate fate of all this junk is. And these were not people that had clinical symptoms of hoarding. They were just not all that atypical of American consumers. But anyway, in the end, I do have to say this. She talks about organizing your stuff, getting rid of things that actually don't have any value to you anymore, and stuff like how to fold your clothes so when you open the drawer you can see what's in there and stuff. And one value of that is if you know what you actually have, that makes it less likely that you're going to go out and buy another one because you can find it. So there are some issues with that in the U.S. as well. Buying duplicates because you can't not organized enough to keep track of what you got. So, out of sight, out of mind. Away is the ultimate abdication of responsibility. Away is a mythic place. And a myth is a widely held but false belief or idea. There is no away. And maybe there's no such thing as disposable either. Away. There is no away. Thank you. Thank you all.
Questions?
Sure.
When you see those round bins at the grocery store that says, recycle your clean plastic bags here, do they actually recycle those bags or do they throw them away? Can they recycle those bags?
Our recycling expert should answer that, not me.
Right here.
Okay.
No, I would, they would probably do some backhauling. I think it'd be worth it for me to find out where Fry's takes their bags. I know that Walmart also collects their grocery bags as well. And to see where they're backhauling it to would be of interest. Because we learned here this evening about the low-density polyethylene, those plastic bags, anything that's crunchy or in a bag that's hard to recycle. So it'd be good. I do not believe that they are throwing it away, but I think it would be important for us to know as consumers, or also if we go there and of our own goodness and caring that we want to place our plastic bags there, we should know. So I'll get back to Molly on this.
Okay.
Would that be good?
Yeah.
So,
I've been told that the plastic bags mess up the machinery.
Yes.
And that's why you don't recycle them there. Not
That would be why you don't want to put them in a recycling bin.
But that doesn't.
And they're directing you to put them in those collection boxes. And you would assume that they're recycling them. However, if you look at the recycling list, those bags appear to be on one of those lists of things they don't get recycled. So I don't know the answer.
Yeah.
What happens to yard waste that the village comes by, picks up everyone's twigs? And
I don't live in Prescott, so I can start off by leading in there. Each community has their own answer to that question. But there is a transfer station there on Sundog Ranch Road, and the transfer station grinds all that stuff up. They have a super duper grinder, and they offer it up to the public free. And they'll even load you if you time your visit right. It takes a while to pick all the trash out of it because there's pieces of drip systems. Yes, drip systems in there and other things in there. But at least as far as I know, that would not be going to the landfill.
Jump on that if I may.
Sure.
Because you're talking right correctly. In order for us to accept your wood waste, and I make a distinction between green waste and wood waste, because in the nomenclature of waste management, the green waste would be the putrescibles, those grass clippings and the leaves that we were talking about. We do not have a composting facility going in the city of Prescott at this time. But for the wood waste, and I'm going to circle back to what I think you were talking about, is that we only take from trees or from brush. And so we do not take any treated wood, we do not take any dimensional wood, we don't take any Trex, alt wood products. So we do have a great chipper. I'm so glad you noticed that. And we do chip it up and we do give it away to the public. It is a marvelous mulch. A lot of our work, like for the month of June, it's free. On Fridays and Saturdays, we're increasing this one day. And you can bring in your brush debris And we will chip it and we'll put it in our piles. We'll load you up if you want some any time of the year. You had mentioned about putting out the green waste at the curb. Are you referring to our recent bulky waste item pickup, where people put a lot of their couches and bags of pine needles and all sorts of things? We went through the community. So all of those materials are going to the landfill. So we're not screening that waste to go to the woody debris pile, especially if they're in plastic bags.
That's unfortunate. In my neighborhood, there were lots of twigs on the curb.
So we're going around with a rear loader truck and a Kubota tractor afterwards and going through everyone. If we can perhaps do better education, if you want those materials to go into our wood debris program or to make chips, then I would suggest you self-haul to the transfer station.
I think it would be a really great follow-up here and for the educational purposes to develop a list of resources that are in existence, and that includes this chipper program that you have, and it includes Dave and stepping stones stores where you can just drop things off, and those things just come back into the cycle even if you don't shop there. But there's that would be a really good resource to develop, to distribute, and then maybe more things will come. Maybe we will get a composting system like they have in San Francisco, which is a big city. They can do it. We could do that.
It all depends how much you want to pay for at the curb. for sure.
Well, you know,
the
prices, there's all kinds of costs that are buried in these things, and we will pay the cost for it later when you know, we have the greenhouse gas and we have the plastics and everything. We'll pay for medical costs. So you want to pay it at the curb and get it cleaned up, or you want to pay for it later?
We kind of stop thinking when we get past our prefrontal lobe, prefrontal lobe, don't we? We don't think.
Yeah.
Long term.
Yeah, the costs, like that clothing example, 3% of our, you know, we used to spend this was true, by the way, this is true of food as well. We used to spend 13 to 15% of our annual budget on clothing. Now we spend 3.5%. That 3.5% does not capture the environmental cost of producing those synthetic fibers, shipping, you know, the environmental cost of shipping it all over the place, and the environmental cost of landfilling it and so on. And with regard to recycling, my comment on that too is that capitalism will not fix our recycling problems because there's not enough profit motivation there. The stuff's not worth enough at this time for us to do something with it. So
we're just, and I'm going to add to that, being in the food world, is that 50% of the finished food supply, not the leftovers in the field, in this country is wasted. And worldwide, I think it's 30%. In some countries, it's probably very, very little because there are people who are starving. But if we are going to make this world work with all these people, we need to not waste food as well. And a lot of it is not even what you think of in your kitchen, but it is at the grocery stores. And we have also another resource that we could tap into is the Food Recovery Project. So that if you happen to have a store, I think it's very effective to go into the grocery store and say, what happens to the outdated products here? Not just the fruits and vegetables and meat that you're thinking of that are very perishable, but they throw away all kinds of stuff that is edible. and will last a long time just because it's beyond the date. So I think that we should make a goal, the three of us and maybe more, of developing a, I don't want to call it recycling or reusable or repurposing list, resource list that maybe we could have online on the city site, and we could keep updated, because you know these things are going to change. But it would be nice to have that resource so that when you have, they cut down the tree in your yard because of the big snowstorm, you know, what can be done with that? Well, I want to thank Kathleen for bringing us all this information, quite a bit, quite extensive, and I want to thank you all for coming today and for experiencing another event in our Earth Week. And by the way, tomorrow I will be at the Farmers Market at Chino Valley High School from 10 to 1, demonstrating the planetary diet, how we can have more healthier and more efficient and more planet-friendly diet that still tastes great. So maybe I'll see you there tomorrow.
Which high school?
Chino Valley, Prescott High School.
Okay, that's what I thought, yeah.
Did I say Chino Valley?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Prescott High School. Thank you for coming.
No, that's fine. I was kind of geared and gonna ride my bike there, and then all of a sudden I'm like,
Yeah, that just came out of the back of my brain.
okay, 10 to 1.
10 to 1.
You'll be
Yeah. We'll have food samples. Thank you.